The liberation of valuelessness, why good and evil are human inventions. The moral theater, when the curtain falls on right and wrong. What if everything you've been taught about right and wrong is a lie? Not a noble lie that serves society, not a useful fiction that helps people cooperate. Just a lie, a system of control dressed up as cosmic truth. What if good and evil have no more objective reality than up has in empty space? Consider the extraordinary claim that morality makes, that certain actions are objectively wrong, not just disliked, not just harmful, not just socially discouraged, but actually truly, cosmically wrong, that the universe itself somehow condemns murder, rewards kindness, judges cruelty. This is an astonishing assertion that has never been proven and can never be proven. Look at the night sky. Those stars don't care if you lie or tell the truth. That vast darkness doesn't judge whether you help or harm. The laws of physics operate identically for saints and serial killers. The universe is utterly indifferent to what you call morality. Good and evil exist nowhere in the fabric of reality, only in human imagination. Every moral system is a human construction. Medieval Christians believed heresy was the worst evil imaginable. Ancient Romans thought cowardice in battle was ultimate shame. Modern progressives consider certain speech the highest sin. These systems contradict each other, yet each claims to access objective moral truth. They can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. The variation in moral beliefs across cultures and time reveals morality's constructed nature. What's virtuous in one society is criminal in another. What's noble in one era is barbaric in the next. If morality were objective, like mathematics or physics, these dramatic variations wouldn't exist. The fact that murder is wrong needs the qualifier, but not in war or self-defense or capital punishment, or reveals it's not really an objective principle. Moral language tries to hide this arbitrariness. We say actions should or shouldn't be done as if this references something real. But should, according to what? God's commands? They're contested and unverifiable. Human welfare, that's just preference masquerading as obligation. Natural law, nature is amoral, full of what we'd call cruelty, selfishness, and violence. The history of moral philosophy is the history of failed attempts to ground morality in something objective. Divine command theory fails because we can't verify divine commands. Kantian deontology fails because categorical imperatives are arbitrary assertions. Utilitarianism fails because maximizing happiness is just one possible preference, not a moral fact. Every system ultimately rests on unprovable assumptions. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He declared that God is dead, and with God's death went the foundation for objective morality. What remained were power relationships dressed in moral language. The good was whatever served the interests of those defining morality. Slave morality and master morality weren't true or false. They were expressions of different power positions. The question isn't whether you should be moral. Should is meaningless without objective morality. The question is whether you want to follow particular social rules and what consequences you're willing to accept for following or breaking them. Morality becomes pragmatics, not metaphysics. This realization is initially terrifying to most people. If morality is invented, if good and evil are fictions, doesn't that mean anything goes? Doesn't that justify atrocity? But this fear reveals how deeply we've internalized moral mythology. The absence of objective morality doesn't create chaos. It reveals the actual basis for human cooperation, which was never morality to begin with. The guilt machine, how invented obligations create real suffering. You feel guilty about something you did, something you didn't do, something you thought about doing. This guilt feels real, feels justified, feels like response to actual wrongdoing. But what if it's just psychological machinery responding to fictional obligations? What if guilt is a social control mechanism, not moral perception? Guilt requires believing you violated an actual obligation. But where do obligations come from? Who wrote the cosmic rulebook? Guilt assumes that you shouldn't have done that references something real. But strip away the social conditioning, the religious indoctrination, the cultural programming. What remains? Just actions and consequences, preferences and power. No should or shouldn't anywhere. Different cultures create guilt about wildly different things. Shame cultures induce guilt about bringing dishonor to family. Purity cultures create guilt about sexual thoughts. Achievement cultures generate guilt about insufficient productivity. Each system makes its subjects feel genuinely guilty about violating its particular invented rules. The mechanism is elegant. First, authority figures, parents, priests, teachers, society, assert that certain behaviors are wrong, not just undesirable, but morally wrong. Second, punishment, physical or social, is applied when rules are broken. Third, you internalize the rules and begin punishing yourself through guilt when you violate them. You've been programmed to torture yourself for breaking invented commandments. Religious guilt demonstrates this most obviously. People feel crushing guilt about sins that harm nobody: masturbation, doubting doctrine, eating forbidden foods, working on Sabbaths. The guilt is real, the suffering genuine, but it's response to completely arbitrary rules that have no objective moral status. You're suffering because someone convinced you an imaginary authority figure disapproves. Secular guilt is equally constructed but better camouflaged. You feel guilty about not working hard enough, not being present enough, not optimizing yourself enough. These guilts serve economic and social systems that benefit from your self-flagellation. You're less likely to question a system when you're busy feeling guilty about not serving it better. Moral philosophy has tried to make guilt rational by grounding it in objective obligations, but this fails. Kantian guilt about violating categorical imperatives? The imperatives are just assertions. Utilitarian guilt about reducing aggregate happiness. That assumes happiness is objectively valuable. Virtue ethics, guilt about character defects. The virtues are culturally determined. The variation in what people feel guilty about reveals guilt's constructed nature. Some feel guilty about eating meat. Others feel guilty about not providing for family through any means necessary. Some feel guilty about not recycling. Others feel guilty about not having enough children. These guilts are incompatible, yet each feels objectively justified to those experiencing it. Neurotic guilt, excessive guilt about minor infractions, is just the guilt mechanism malfunctioning, like a too sensitive alarm. But this reveals that all guilt is the same mechanism. There's no fundamental difference between appropriate and inappropriate guilt, just socially calibrated versus miscalibrated responses to invented rules. The function of guilt is social control. A population that polices itself through internalized guilt is easier to manage than one requiring external enforcement. Guilt is how authority becomes self-sustaining. You enforce rules on yourself that someone else made up, suffering real psychological pain for violating fictional obligations. Children are born without guilt. They must be taught it carefully and systematically. The process of moral education is the process of installing guilt machinery. We call this developing a conscience. But it's really programming a self-punishment system based on whoever's doing the programming's preferred rules. The relief of recognizing guilt's baseless nature is profound. You feel guilty about something. You examine the supposed obligation you violated. You discover it's just a rule someone made up that has no objective basis. The guilt doesn't immediately disappear. Conditioning runs deep, but its authority is undermined. You're no longer answerable to imaginary obligations. This doesn't mean you become callous or harmful. It means you stop torturing yourself psychologically for breaking rules that have no more cosmic validity than preferring chocolate to vanilla. You might still follow certain rules for practical or preferential reasons, but you're no longer suffering the unique agony of guilt, which requires believing in objective moral failure. The archaeology of morality, excavating where values really come from. Trace any moral rule back far enough, and you'll find not divine revelation or rational deduction, but evolutionary pressure, tribal advantage, or raw power assertion. Morality isn't discovered, it's evolved and invented. Understanding its actual origins dissolves the illusion of its objectivity. Evolution created proto-moral sentiments, reciprocal altruism, kin selection, coalition building. These aren't morality, but survival mechanisms. The feeling that you should help family members is just genes protecting copies of themselves. The intuition that fairness matters is just cognitive machinery that enabled cooperation in tribal contexts, evolution optimized for genetic success, not for accessing moral truth. The moralization of evolved tendencies came later. Humans took feelings that evolution created for survival purposes and reinterpreted them as moral insights. The protective instinct toward children became the moral rule: protect the innocent. The reciprocal cooperation instinct became treat others as you want to be treated. The revenge instinct became justice. But these reinterpretations are false. That you feel protective toward children doesn't mean protecting children is objectively good. It just means natural selection favored ancestors who protected offspring. That you feel reciprocal obligations doesn't mean reciprocity is morally required. It just means social organisms that cooperated outcompeted ones that didn't. Religious morality is especially transparent in its invented nature. Someone, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, announces rules allegedly from divine authority. Followers adopt these rules. Eventually, the rules become objective morality. But the origin is always someone making claims about supernatural communication that can never be verified. The 10 Commandments illustrate this perfectly. Thou shalt not kill sounds objective, but actually it's thou shalt not kill except when God commands it, or in war, or in self-defense, or in capital punishment. The rule is flexible enough to permit any killing the rule makers want to permit. This isn't objective morality. It's authority using moral language to enforce preferences. Different religions provide contradictory moral rules, each claiming divine origin. Jainism forbids killing any living thing. Christianity permits killing in various contexts. Islam has different rules about killing than Christianity. If any accessed objective moral truth, they'd converge. Instead, they diverge wildly, revealing their human origins. Secular moral philosophy tried to escape religion's obvious arbitrariness by grounding morality in reason. But reason can only work from axioms, and moral axioms are always unjustified assertions. Maximize happiness sounds rational until you ask why. Rational is, if you want X, do Y. But you should want X isn't rational. It's preference dressed as obligation. Social contract theory grounds morality in mutual agreement. But this just makes morality contractual, not objective. You follow rules because you agreed to, not because they're objectively binding, and social contracts are always negotiated by unequal parties. Those with power dictate terms to those without. Morality becomes might, making right. Historical moral progress reveals morality's constructed nature. Slavery was moral, then immoral. Women's subjugation was moral, then immoral. LGBTQ relationships were immoral, now increasingly moral. If morality were objective, these changes would be impossible. You can't progress toward or away from objective truth that doesn't change. Moral progress is just changing preferences claiming moral authority. Anthropology shows enormous moral variation. Cultures with honor killing, cultures with radical pacifism, cultures with cannibalism, cultures with extreme individualism, each considers its morality correct, others' morality wrong. The outside observer sees that all are just different cultural constructions, none objectively true. The neuroscience of moral judgment reveals its emotional reaction, rationalized after the fact. Brain scans show moral judgments activating emotion centers before reasoning centers. We feel disgust or approval, then construct justifications. We're not accessing moral truth. We're rationalizing gut reactions shaped by evolution and culture. Understanding morality's actual origins, evolution, culture, power, doesn't tell you how to act, but it does free you from believing your moral feelings access objective reality. They're just feelings shaped by forces that don't care about truth. Recognizing this is the first step toward liberation from moral mythology. The tyranny of should, language that creates imaginary obligations. The word should is perhaps the most insidious in language. It smuggles in the assumption of objective obligation while hiding its complete lack of foundation. You should help others. You shouldn't lie. You should feel guilty. Each assertion pretends to reference something real, but actually references nothing. Should according to whom? Should according to what? The word always implies an unstated authority. You should X secretly means I demand you X, or society commands you X, or my preferred moral system requires you X. But naked power assertions don't command easy obedience, so they disguise themselves as objective obligations using should. Try replacing should with I want you to in moral statements. You should be kind becomes I want you to be kind. The true nature is revealed, its preference, not obligation. I want you to can be refused without violating objective reality. You should pretends refusal violates something cosmic. Should is also used to disguise conditional statements as unconditional ones. You should exercise actually means if you want to be healthy, you should exercise. The condition is omitted to make it seem like obligation rather than instrumental advice. Revealing the hidden conditional shows the statement is hypothetical, not categorical. Different authorities issue contradictory shoulds with equal confidence. Your parents say you should honor family. Your employer says you should prioritize career. Your religion says you should serve God. Social media says you should care about every global tragedy. Each should claims authority, yet they often conflict. They can't all reference objective obligations, but they can all be baseless assertions. The multiplication of shoulds in modern life creates crushing weight. You should be productive, healthy, educated, financially secure, environmentally conscious, socially aware, politically active, emotionally available, physically fit, culturally sophisticated. Each should is another imaginary obligation you're failing to meet. The sum is paralysis, and guilt. Children are taught should thinking early. You should share. You shouldn't hit. The conditioning runs so deep that by adulthood, should statements feel like they reference something real. The psychological weight is genuine, even though the obligation is fictional. You've been trained to respond to should the way Pavlov's dogs respond to bells. Moral philosophy is largely the study of what people should do. Thousands of years of sophisticated argumentation about obligations that don't exist. The entire field assumes should references something real, then argues about what that something is. But the foundation is false. There is no should in the universe, just human assertions. Replacing should thinking with want or prefer thinking is liberating. Not, I should help this person, but do I want to help this person? Not, I shouldn't lie, but do I want the consequences of lying? This transforms morality from obligation to choice, from duty to preference. The resistance to abandoning should reveals how deeply moral mythology penetrates. People insist there must be real shoulds, because without them everything is permitted, but everything is already permitted by the universe. The laws of physics don't prohibit murder. Shoulds never prevented anything except by being backed by consequences, social or legal punishment. Remove the mystification and the practical reality remains unchanged. Should is useful for authority. Parents, rulers, priests, employers all benefit from subjects believing they objectively should obey. The moral weight of should supplements physical force and social pressure. A population convinced they should behave certain ways is easier to control than one that recognizes rules as arbitrary. Guilt and shame require should thinking. You feel guilty because you did what you shouldn't have done, but recognize shouldn't as meaningless assertion, and guilt loses its foundation. The psychological suffering remains temporarily. Conditioning doesn't vanish instantly, but its justification disappears. The fantasy of objective shoulds is comforting for many. It would be nice if the universe provided clear moral guidance, if there were cosmic rules you could follow to be definitely good. But this comfort comes at the cost of truth. The universe is silent on what you should do because should is a human invention that references nothing real. The collapse of sacred categories. Nothing is inherently holy or evil. Certain acts, people, or things are designated sacred, supposedly possessing inherent holiness demanding reverence. Others are designated evil or taboo, inherently polluted, demanding avoidance. But these categories are projections, not perceptions. Nothing is inherently sacred or evil. These are human designations with no objective reality. Consider what different cultures designate as sacred. Cows, crosses, Qurans, flags, ancestors, mountains, rivers. Each culture is certain its sacred objects really are sacred, but the outside observer sees that sacredness is just cultural designation. The cow isn't objectively sacred. Hindus treat it as sacred, while others eat it. Sacredness is in the treating, not in the object. The violation of sacredness feels objectively wrong to believers. Burning a flag, desecrating a religious text, disrespecting a sacred site, these generate genuine moral outrage. But this outrage is response to violated cultural rules, not violated cosmic principles. What's sacred to one group is ordinary or even contemptible to another. Evil categories work similarly. Certain acts are designated not just harmful or undesirable, but inherently evil. Murder, rape, torture, these seem like they must be objectively evil, but this is just moral intuition shaped by evolution and culture, treated as metaphysical insight. The acts cause immense suffering, but evil is the human label, not an objective property. The variability of evil categories reveals their constructed nature. Homosexuality was evil now, in many places it isn't. Lending money at interest was evil. Now it's normal business. Eating pork is evil to some, permissible to others. Each group is convinced their evil designations are objective, yet they contradict each other. They can't all be right about objective evil, but they can all be wrong. Taboos are sacredness in reverse, things considered inherently polluting that must be avoided. Menstruation, corpses, certain foods, certain words. The taboo violation creates visceral disgust in believers. But again, what's taboo varies wildly across cultures, revealing that taboo is cultural construction, not natural category. The psychological power of sacred and evil categories is undeniable. People kill over sacred violations. They suffer intense disgust at evil exposure. But powerful psychological response doesn't indicate objective reality. It indicates effective conditioning. You can be trained to feel anything is sacred or evil. Religious traditions typically ground sacredness in divine designation. God made this sacred. But this just shifts the question back. How do you know God made it sacred? Through revelation? That's unprovable. Through scripture? Someone wrote that. Through tradition? That's just accumulated convention. The foundation is always human assertion. Secular attempts to preserve sacredness without divinity, human rights as sacred, rationality as sacred, dignity as sacred, are equally baseless. These things aren't actually sacred. Calling them sacred is rhetorical move to prevent questioning, but anything can be questioned, and declaring something sacred is just demanding it shouldn't be. The collapse of sacred categories is psychologically challenging for many. If nothing is sacred, then nothing is protected from analysis, criticism, violation. But this is actually liberating. You're no longer bound by arbitrary designations. The reverence you feel for sacred things can continue as preference, but without the delusion that your reverence corresponds to objective holiness. Similarly, recognizing that nothing is inherently evil doesn't mean you become callous about suffering. You can still prefer to prevent suffering, still punish harmful acts, still protect the vulnerable. But you do this from preference and pragmatics, not from delusion that you're combating objective evil. The function of sacred and evil categories is social control. Designating things sacred prevents questioning. Designating things evil permits persecution. Both categories create in-groups, sacred keepers, and out-groups, evildoers or sacred violators. These categories serve power, not truth. The exhaustion of righteousness, the cost of believing you're good. The belief that you're morally good is perhaps the most exhausting belief you can hold. It requires constant monitoring, endless justification, perpetual anxiety about maintaining your status. Righteousness is a performance that never ends, a standard you can never rest from pursuing, a burden disguised as achievement. The righteous person must constantly evaluate their actions against moral standards. Did I do the right thing? Am I being good enough? Would a truly good person have done differently? This endless self-surveillance is psychologically depleting. You're never just acting, you're always evaluating your actions morally. Righteousness requires comparing yourself favorably to others. The good person identifies bad people and confirms their superiority. This requires finding fault in others, interpreting their actions uncharitably, maintaining categories of moral inferiority. The righteous person's goodness depends on others' badness. Modern righteousness takes new forms, but remains equally exhausting. Political righteousness, holding correct political views, supporting correct causes, condemning correct enemies, consumer righteousness, buying ethical products, avoiding unethical companies. Social media righteousness, performing correct opinions, calling out incorrectness. Each domain requires vigilance and generates anxiety. The righteous person lives in perpetual fear of hypocrisy discovery. You've declared yourself good, but you know your private thoughts and behaviors don't always match public performance. The gap between righteous presentation and actual life creates anxiety. You must maintain the performance while hiding the contradictions. Righteousness creates hostile relationships. You view those with different moral views, not just as wrong, but as bad. They're not just mistaken, they're morally inferior. This transforms disagreements into moral warfare. The righteous person cannot grant others different but equally valid moral views because that would undermine their own righteousness. The energy spent maintaining righteousness is enormous, researching which companies are ethical, staying informed about which views are correct, policing your language and behavior, performing righteousness on social media, condemning the insufficiently righteous. This is full-time work disguised as virtue. Different groups compete in righteousness Olympics. Who's most committed to justice? Who's most ethically pure? Who calls out badness most effectively? The competition is endless because righteousness is relative. You're good compared to others, so you must constantly establish that others are worse. Righteous exhaustion explains the appeal of cynicism. The cynical person has abandoned the performance. They're not trying to be good, not claiming moral superiority, not monitoring their virtue. This provides relief from righteousness's burdens, even if it comes with different costs. The recognition that good and evil are fictions eliminates righteousness's foundation. If moral categories aren't real, you can't be objectively good. You can act according to your preferences, follow rules you find useful, even try to reduce suffering, but you're not performing goodness. You're just acting, free from moral performance's exhausting demands. This doesn't mean you become worse. You might become better in practical terms. Without needing to perform righteousness, you're free to actually help people rather than performing helping. Without needing to condemn the immoral, you can understand different choices without moral judgment. Without maintaining goodness identity, you can act spontaneously rather than self-consciously. The righteous person might object. Without believing in goodness, you'll have no motivation to act well. But this assumes moral motivation is the only motivation you can prefer to help others. Without believing helping is objectively good. You can avoid harming without believing harming is objectively evil. Preference is sufficient. Objective morality is unnecessary. The fiction of moral responsibility. Why blame and praise make no sense. Moral responsibility assumes you're the author of your actions in a deep metaphysical sense. You could have done otherwise, you chose freely, you deserve credit or blame for outcomes, but this assumption doesn't withstand examination. Responsibility is fiction that serves social functions, but corresponds to nothing real. Your actions emerge from prior causes, genes, environment, experiences, brain chemistry, random factors. The decision you just made was determined by factors you didn't choose. You didn't choose your genes, your childhood, your neurology. These factors produced your personality, which produced your decision. Where's the authorship? The libertarian free will defense that you have special causation-breaking power has no evidence. Every study of decision-making shows physical brain activity preceding conscious awareness of decisions. Your brain decides, then you become conscious of the decision and claim authorship. The subjective experience of free choice doesn't prove actual metaphysical freedom. Even if you had some limited freedom, it would be freedom operating within constraints you didn't choose. You're free to choose within your personality, but you didn't choose your personality. You're free to make decisions, but your decision-making criteria were given to you. The freedom, if it exists, is so constrained that responsibility seems absurd. The logic of moral responsibility requires being causa sui, self-caused, but nothing causes itself. You'd need to exist before you existed to choose what you'd become. Every trait you have traces back to causes prior to your existence. You're effect, not cause, yet moral responsibility treats you as prime mover. Luck eliminates responsibility. You're lucky in your genes, lucky in your upbringing, lucky in your experiences, lucky in your brain chemistry, lucky in your opportunities. The criminal who harms others had different luck than you. The saint who helps others had different luck. Both are products of factors beyond their control. Determinism is one problem, but randomness is another. Even if some aspect of decision-making is quantum random, that doesn't create responsibility. If your decision was random, you didn't author it. Randomness authored it. Responsibility requires neither determinism nor randomness, but impossible self-creation. The function of moral responsibility is social control through reward and punishment. Societies claim you deserve punishment for wrong actions because you're responsible. But deserve is meaningless without responsibility, and responsibility is incoherent. What remains is just pragmatic punishment. We punish to modify behavior and protect society, not because anyone deserves it. Praise and admiration have the same problem. You admire someone for achievements they didn't truly author. Their talent came from genetics and development. Their opportunities came from circumstances. Their choices came from who they were, which came from factors they didn't control. The admiration is response to fiction of authorship. Resentment and gratitude require responsibility fiction. You resent someone who harmed you because they could have done otherwise. You're grateful to someone who helped because they chose to when they could have refused. But both assumptions are false. They couldn't have done otherwise. Given their complete causal history, their actions were determined. The recognition that responsibility is fiction doesn't immediately eliminate feelings of blame or praise. These are deep emotional patterns, but it undermines their justification. You might still feel angry at someone who harms you, but you can recognize this anger as emotional reaction, not response to genuine moral failure. Legal systems depend on responsibility fiction. Criminals are punished because they're responsible for crimes, but this is just social machinery, not moral truth. We can maintain practical legal systems without believing in metaphysical responsibility, punishment for deterrence and protection, not because anyone deserves it. The liberation from responsibility is profound. You're not responsible for your failures because you didn't author them, but neither are you responsible for your successes. They came from factors beyond your control. This eliminates both guilt and pride, replacing them with recognition that you're product of causes, not autonomous agent. The power behind morality. Who benefits from your belief in good and evil? Ask cui bono, who benefits, about any moral system, and you'll discover morality's true function. Moral rules don't descend from heaven or emerge from pure reason. They're created by those in power to serve their interests, then disguised as objective truth to secure compliance. Religious morality most obviously serves priestly classes. Obedience to God means obedience to God's interpreters, the priests. Donations to God mean donations to religious institutions, Sexual morality controls reproduction and family structure in ways that stabilize religious community. Every divine commandment somehow benefits those claiming to speak for divinity. Feudal morality served aristocracy. Peasants were taught that accepting their position was virtuous, that hierarchy was divinely ordained, that obedience to lords was moral duty. This morality kept peasants working and prevented revolution. The morality's function was maintaining power structure, not accessing ethical truth. Capitalist morality serves capital, the Protestant work ethic, the valorization of productivity, the moral duty to work. These beliefs benefit employers, not workers. You're taught that laziness is immoral because your labor creates others' wealth. The morality serves economic system, not your well-being. Nationalist morality serves state power. Patriotism as virtue, sacrifice for nation as nobility, loyalty to country as duty. These beliefs make populations willing to fight and die for state interests. The morality creates compliant citizens who subordinate personal interests to national ones. Consumer morality serves corporate interests. You should care about how you look, what you drive, what you own. These manufactured moral concerns create insecurity that drives consumption. The moral inadequacy you feel about your possessions generates the spending that enriches corporations. Political morality serves party interests. Each political faction develops moral language that makes their preferences seem objectively good and opponents' preferences seem objectively evil. The moralization of politics, treating policy differences as moral differences, makes compromise impossible and benefits those who profit from polarization. Social justice morality can serve academic and activist interests. Those who establish themselves as morally advanced gain status, employment, authority. The ever-expanding list of moral requirements creates perpetual need for moral educators and consultants. The system sustains itself by creating work for its administrators. This doesn't mean all moral claims are cynically manipulative. Many believers genuinely believe. But genuine belief doesn't change morality's function. The medieval peasant genuinely believed obedience was virtuous, but this belief still served aristocratic interests. Sincere belief in false morality is more useful to power than cynical compliance. The test is simple. Does a moral rule benefit those promoting it? Religious authorities benefit from rules requiring religious observance. Employers benefit from rules valorizing work. States benefit from rules promoting patriotism. The correlation is perfect. Moral rules always serve their promoters' interests. The clever move is universalizing particular interests. What's good for General Motors is good for America, makes corporate interests seem like universal interests. Family values makes particular family structure seem universally valuable. Civic duty makes state service seem like moral obligation. Particular benefits disguise themselves as universal goods. Understanding morality's power function doesn't immediately free you from its influence. Conditioning runs deep, but it reveals that moral claims are often negotiations and power struggles, not neutral ethical observations. When someone tells you what you should do, ask who benefits from your compliance. The recognition that morality serves power is itself liberating. You're not answerable to objective moral reality. You're just navigating social systems that use moral language to enforce rules. You can choose which rules to follow based on pragmatic calculation rather than moral conviction. This doesn't mean you become a moral monster. It means you recognize that preventing harm, helping others, and cooperating with community are preferences you might hold, not obligations you must fulfill. You act from your own values rather than from imposed moral requirements that serve others' interests. The democracy of amorality, how valuelessness creates actual equality. Moral systems always create hierarchies, the righteous and the sinful, the virtuous and the vicious, the good and the evil. These hierarchies stratify humanity into moral castes. But amoral perspective dissolves these hierarchies. If good and evil aren't real, everyone is equal in their moral status, which is to say, everyone has no moral status. Traditional morality claims to establish equality, all souls equal before God, all humans possessing equal dignity. But it actually creates profound inequality, the saved versus the damned, the pure versus the polluted, the moral versus the immoral. These divisions are more brutal than economic or political inequality because they're framed as ultimate, cosmic, deserved. The moral hierarchy's cruelty is its claim to reflect reality. The poor can recognize economic inequality as contingent, possibly changeable, but the morally inferior are told their inferiority reflects their essence. The sinner deserves condemnation, the vicious merit contempt, the evil warrant hatred. Moral hierarchy makes inequality seem just. Punishment within moral frameworks is rationalized by desert. The wrongdoer deserves suffering. This makes spectacular cruelty permissible, eternal damnation, torture, dehumanization, all justified because the victim is morally inferior. The worst atrocities in history have been committed by those certain of their moral superiority over victims. Recognizing good and evil as fictions eliminates the foundation for moral hierarchy. Nobody is actually better than anyone else in cosmic sense. The saint and the serial killer are equally products of causes beyond their control. One had fortunate causes, the other had unfortunate causes, but neither has different inherent moral worth, because moral worth doesn't exist. This doesn't mean treating everyone identically in practice. You protect society from dangerous people. You reward helpful behavior and discourage harmful behavior, but you do this pragmatically, not from belief that dangerous people deserve suffering or helpful people deserve reward. The actions are the same, but the justified hatred is gone. The amoral perspective enables actual compassion for everyone, including wrongdoers. The person who commits atrocities didn't author their atrocity-committing nature. They were produced by genetics, environment, experiences that could have produced you in their situation. Recognizing this doesn't excuse their actions, but eliminates the moral contempt that prevents understanding. Moral hierarchy prevents this understanding. The evil person must be fundamentally different from you. They chose evil where you choose good. This difference justifies their suffering. But recognizing moral fictions reveals they're not fundamentally different. They had different luck. You could have been them. The equality of amorality is more profound than moral equality. Moral systems claim everyone is equal, then immediately create hierarchies based on moral performance. A moral perspective has no performance to hierarchize. No one is better or worse morally because morality isn't real. This equality extends across all conventional moral categories. No race is morally superior. No culture is more virtuous. No religion is more righteous. No political view is more ethical. All moral superiority claims are equally baseless. The playing field is level because there's no game. Historical moral hierarchies have rationalized every oppression. Slavery was morally justified because enslaved people were morally inferior. Genocide was rationalized because victims were evil. Subjugation was acceptable because the subjugated were less virtuous. All these hierarchies claim to reflect moral reality. The recognition that these hierarchies were fictions came slowly and incompletely. We now recognize the slavery-justifying morality was false, but we maintain other moral hierarchies: good versus evil political opponents, virtuous versus vicious lifestyles, morally correct versus incorrect views. These are equally baseless. The full recognition of amorality's democracy is psychologically challenging. It means you're not better than people you despise. Your moral superiority over wrongdoers is illusion. You're equal to everyone in the only way that matters. Everyone is equally product of causes beyond their control, equally lacking objective moral status. But this challenging recognition is also liberating. You're no longer required to perform moral superiority. You don't need to establish your virtue by condemning others' vice. You can interact with full range of humanity without moral hierarchies creating artificial distance. Everyone is simply human, complex, caused, morally neutral. The relief of moral retirement. What happens when you stop trying to be good? The project of being morally good is exhausting. Constant vigilance, endless self-evaluation, perpetual anxiety about moral adequacy. What if you just stopped? What if you retired from morality, not to become immoral, but to simply be amoral? What relief might that bring? Moral retirement means abandoning the attempt to be objectively good. You stop evaluating your actions as morally right or wrong. You stop trying to perfect your moral character. You stop monitoring whether you're good enough. The entire project is recognized as responding to fictions and therefore abandoned. This doesn't mean you start harming people. Your preferences probably include not wanting to cause suffering. Your pragmatic calculations probably favor cooperation over conflict. Your emotional responses probably include empathy, but these operate without moral overlay. You're not being good. You're acting according to preferences and calculations. The immediate relief is from moral self-evaluation. You act, and instead of asking, "Was that morally right?" you ask, "Did that produce consequences I prefer?" The simplification is profound. Moral evaluation adds nothing to pragmatic evaluation except anxiety and guilt. Moral retirement eliminates guilt's foundation. Guilt requires believing you violated objective obligations. Without belief in objective morality, guilt has no basis. You might regret actions that produced unwanted consequences. But this is different from guilt. Regret is about outcomes. Guilt is about imaginary, cosmic violations. You also stop requiring moral justification for your preferences. You don't need to establish that helping others is objectively good to justify helping them. You can simply prefer to help. You don't need to prove that your lifestyle is morally correct. You can simply live according to your preferences. The retired person stops trying to persuade others through moral argument. You don't claim your political views are morally superior. They're just your preferences based on your values and analysis. You don't condemn others' choices as immoral. You simply have different preferences. The conversation becomes negotiation, not moral warfare. Moral retirement transforms relationships. You stop judging people as good or bad. You see everyone as products of causes, pursuing preferences, making calculations. This enables understanding without moral contempt. The person who behaves badly isn't evil. They're just responding to different pressures and possessing different preferences. You stop performing morality for social approval. No more posting political opinions to demonstrate righteousness. No more conspicuous ethical consumption to signal virtue. No more moral grandstanding. You act according to your actual preferences rather than performing for imagined moral audience. The retirement eliminates moral anxiety about contradictions. You don't need perfect consistency between values because values aren't moral truths requiring consistency. You can hold contradictory preferences without hypocrisy. You can change your mind without moral failing. Inconsistency is just being human. Retired from morality, you might act more ethically in practical terms. Without need to perform righteousness, you can help without spectacle. Without moral contempt for wrongdoers, you can understand and prevent wrongdoing more effectively. Without guilt paralysis, you can address problems pragmatically. The resistance to moral retirement is strong. People fear that without morality, they'll become monsters. But this fear reveals how little they trust their own preferences. If you only avoid harming others because you believe it's objectively wrong, you're already problematic. The person who prefers not to harm doesn't need moral rules. Moral retirement doesn't mean value nihilism. You still have values, preferences, goals. It just means recognizing these as yours, not cosmic truths. You prefer kindness, so you practice kindness. You value fairness, so you pursue fairness. But you're not being objectively good. You're living according to your subjective preferences. The relief is profound and immediate. The burden of moral evaluation lifts. The anxiety about moral adequacy dissolves. The need to justify yourself morally disappears. You're free to act according to preferences without pretending preferences are obligations. You're retired from morality's exhausting project. The impossibility of evil, why even the worst acts aren't truly evil. Murder, torture, genocide, surely these are objectively evil. This is where moral nihilism faces its hardest test. Can we really claim even atrocities lack objective moral status? The answer, however uncomfortable, is yes. Evil is human category projected onto acts, not property inherent in acts themselves. The universe is indifferent to suffering. Stars explode, destroying any nearby civilizations. Asteroids hit planets, causing mass extinctions. Diseases kill millions. Earthquakes devastate. None of this is evil. It's just physics. Evil isn't in the suffering, but in human judgment about suffering. Natural disasters aren't evil because there's no intent. But human-caused suffering seems different. Someone chose to cause it, so it's evil. But this assumes choice creates moral property, which is question-begging. Choice creates causality, not morality. The person who murders caused death, but evil is interpretation you add, not property in the act. The variation in what's considered evil reveals its constructed nature. Honor killing is evil in some cultures, required in others. Capital punishment is evil to some, justice to others. War killings are evil or heroic depending on whose side you're on. If evil were objective, these variations wouldn't exist. The worst atrocities in history were committed by people convinced they were good. Crusaders believed they were serving God. Nazi perpetrators believed they were purifying society. Inquisitors believed they were saving souls. Their victims experienced horror, but perpetrators weren't experiencing themselves as evil. They were certain they were good. This reveals that evil is always in the eye of labeler, not the act itself. The torturer might experience themselves as serving justice. The terrorist might believe they're freedom fighter. The conqueror might think they're civilizing savages. Each has moral framework making their actions seem justified. Evil is what you call acts that violate your particular moral framework. Even the most obviously harmful acts, torturing children for fun, aren't objectively evil. They're acts that nearly all humans find abhorrent because evolution designed us to protect children and feel empathy. But this abhorrence is emotional response, not perception of objective evil property. The strong consensus doesn't make it objective. It makes it universal human preference. The person who commits atrocities is product of causes, genetics, brain damage, trauma, ideology, circumstances. Given their complete causal history, they couldn't have acted differently. They're not choosing evil. They're producing behaviors their causal history determined. Evil assumes agency that doesn't exist. This doesn't mean we shouldn't prevent and punish harmful acts. It means we do so pragmatically, not from delusion that we're combating objective evil. We prevent harm because we prefer less suffering. We punish wrongdoers to protect society and deter others. The practical response remains the same without the moral mythology. The impossibility of evil is actually morally important. It prevents the dehumanization that moral categories enable. Once someone is labeled evil, any treatment of them becomes justified. Torture evil people? They deserve it. Kill evil people? They warrant it. Dehumanize evil people? They're not really human anyway. Evil category enables atrocities. Recognizing that wrongdoers aren't evil but are products of unfortunate causes enables more effective response. Instead of moral condemnation, we can examine what causes produce harmful behavior and address those causes. Punishment for pure desert becomes prevention for pragmatic protection. The emotional resistance to abandoning evil category is strong. We need someone to blame, someone to hate, someone to feel morally superior to evil serves these psychological needs. But serving psychological needs doesn't make evil real. Comfort and truth are different things. The moralization machine. How humans turn preferences into obligations. Humans have a peculiar talent for moralization, taking subjective preferences and transforming them into objective obligations. I prefer X becomes X is objectively good becomes everyone should do X becomes people who don't do X are bad. This transformation is how preferences become morality, how taste becomes commandment. The process is observable in real time. Someone adopts a diet, vegetarianism say. Initially it's preference. I prefer not to eat meat. This evolves into moral claim. Eating meat is wrong, then into obligation. Everyone should be vegetarian. Finally into judgment. Meat eaters are immoral. The preference has been fully moralized. Moral psychology research reveals how automatic this process is. Jonathan Haidt's work shows that moral judgments come first, rationalizations later. We feel disgust or approval, then construct elaborate justifications. We're not reasoning toward moral conclusions. We're rationalizing emotional reactions as if they were moral insights. The moralization machine operates across all domains. Sexual preferences become sexual morality. Food preferences become dietary ethics. Aesthetic preferences become cultural values. Political preferences become moral imperatives. Economic preferences become justice claims. The pattern is universal. Preferences disguise themselves as obligations. The tell is the language shift from I to we to everyone. I don't like X becomes we shouldn't do X becomes X is objectively wrong. The preference starts personal, becomes tribal, finally claims universality, but the underlying basis remains preference, just now asserting itself as cosmic truth. Different groups moralize different preferences, creating contradictory moral systems. Traditionalists moralize their preference for traditional family structures. Progressives moralize their preference for social change. Each group treats their particular preferences as objective moral truths, condemning those with different preferences. The function of moralization is social power. If you can successfully moralize your preference, you gain authority over others. I prefer you don't do X can be refused. You shouldn't do X claims moral authority. X is evil, permits punishment. Moralization transforms preference into power. Children are moralization machines. They learn preferences from their culture, then moralize those preferences with absolute certainty. Yucky foods aren't just disliked, they're wrong to eat. Broken rules aren't just violations, they're evil acts. The child's moral certainty reflects recent moralization before doubt develops. Education often reinforces moralization. We teach children values as if they're objective truths rather than cultural preferences. We present particular moral systems as correct. We reward moral thinking and punish moral skepticism. We're training the next generation's moralization machines. The demystification of moralization is seeing the process clearly. Notice when you shift from "I prefer" to "you should." Notice when you treat your preferences as obligations. Notice when you condemn others for not sharing your preferences. Each instance reveals the moralization machine operating. The alternative is maintaining preference language. I prefer kindness instead of kindness is objectively good. I value fairness instead of fairness is a universal obligation. I dislike cruelty instead of cruelty is evil. This keeps preferences honestly labeled as preferences. But preference language lacks moral authority, which is precisely the point. You can't command others through preferences. You can only persuade. You can't morally condemn different preferences. You can only express disagreement. Preference language is honest about what's actually happening. Different people want different things. The resistance to preference language reveals moralization's appeal. We want our preferences to have objective status. We want to command, not just persuade. We want moral high ground over those we disagree with. Moralization serves these desires, even though it serves them through falsehood. The burden of moral perfectionism. Why goodness is impossible. Moral systems implicitly demand perfection. Be completely honest. Never harm others. Always help those in need. Forgive every wrong. Love everyone. The standards are impossible, which creates perpetual moral failure. You're always falling short, always guilty of imperfection, always morally inadequate. The impossibility is built into moral language. Always and never are absolute. Should and must allow no exceptions. Right and wrong are binary. These linguistic structures create standards that actual, complex, messy human life can never meet. You're set up to fail morally. Religious morality makes this explicit. Sin is inevitable. Perfection is impossible. You need salvation because you cannot be good enough. The system creates the problem it claims to solve. You're condemned by standards you cannot meet, then offered redemption through the same system that condemned you. Secular morality is gentler in language, but identical in structure. You should constantly improve yourself. You should maximize positive impact. You should minimize your carbon footprint. You should support correct causes. You should challenge injustice. The list is infinite. Completion is impossible. The double binds are everywhere. You should help everyone in need, but helping everyone is impossible. So whomever you don't help becomes moral failure. You should speak truth, but truth often harms. So either speaking or withholding truth is moral failure. You should be both compassionate and just, but these often conflict. Every path leads to some moral violation. Utilitarian perfection requires impossible calculation. You should maximize total happiness, but you can't calculate all consequences of your actions. You can't predict distant effects. You can't measure happiness precisely. You're morally required to do impossible math, then blamed for inevitable inaccuracy. Virtue ethics demands perfect character. You should be courageous but not reckless, generous but not wasteful, proud but not vain. These virtues exist in perfect balance, which no actual human achieves. You're always slightly too much of one virtue and too little of another. The golden mean is impossible target. Deontological perfection requires following all moral rules, but rules conflict. Tell truth versus prevent harm. Respect autonomy versus prevent suffering. Keep promises versus adapt to change. Following one rule means breaking another. You're trapped in contradictions the system created. The moral perfectionist lives in constant failure. Every action is evaluated and found wanting. Every day includes moral mistakes. Every interaction has missed obligations. The guilt accumulates endlessly. You're perpetually inadequate relative to impossible standards. The function of impossible standards is control. A population convinced of its perpetual moral inadequacy is easier to manipulate. They seek moral authority to tell them how to do better. They accept punishment for inevitable failings. They never question the system because they blame themselves for not meeting its demands. The liberation is recognizing moral perfection's impossibility isn't your failing, it's morality's structure. The system is designed to create failure. You're not inadequate, the standards are impossible. This recognition doesn't mean abandoning all standards, but abandoning impossible moral ones. Replace moral perfection with pragmatic adequacy. Act in ways that produce consequences you prefer. Follow rules that serve your goals. Help when you can without guilt about infinite need you cannot meet. This is achievable, unlike moral perfection, which no one has ever achieved or ever will. The resistance to abandoning perfectionism reveals how deeply moral conditioning runs. We believe we should be morally perfect even as we recognize it's impossible, but should is meaningless here. You cannot be morally perfect because moral perfection is conceptually impossible, given moral systems' contradictions and life's complexity. The genealogy of conscience, where your inner judge really came from. You have an inner voice that judges your actions, creates guilt, demands moral compliance. This feels innate, like moral intuition or cosmic connection, but it's actually installed, programmed into you through social conditioning. Your conscience is other people's voices internalized, not moral truth speaking through you. Children aren't born with conscience. They must be trained through reward and punishment to develop it. The parent says that's wrong and punishes. The child eventually says that's wrong to themselves and feels guilt. The external judgment has been internalized. The conscience is created. The content of conscience varies by culture, revealing its constructed nature. One culture's conscience condemns eating beef. Another's condemns eating pork. Another's has no food taboos. Each person's conscience feels like objective moral sense, but collectively they contradict each other. They can't all be accessing moral truth. Freud called conscience the superego, internalized parental and social authority. It's not your authentic voice, but installed programming. It speaks with authority because it represents powerful external forces that were internalized during vulnerable developmental period. The conscience's voice sounds like your own thoughts, which disguises its origin. You think I feel guilty about this, rather than the social rules I internalized are creating guilt about this. The internalization is so complete that you can't distinguish between authentic preferences and programmed moral responses. Different authorities install different conscience content. Religious parents install religious conscience. Political activists install political conscience. Consumer culture installs consumer conscience. Each programming feels equally real to its recipients. Each contradicts others. none reflects objective morality. The conscience enforces whatever morality it was programmed with. The devoutly religious person's conscience punishes doubt. The political partisan's conscience punishes incorrect views. The perfectionist's conscience punishes any imperfection. The conscience is neutral technology that enforces whatever content was installed. Conscience malfunction is common. Scrupulosity, obsessive moral anxiety, is conscience too sensitive. Antisocial personality, lack of guilt or remorse, is conscience too weak. Both are conscience programming gone wrong, resulting in over or under response to moral content. The authority of conscience is borrowed authority. It speaks with your parents' voices, your culture's values, your peer group's standards. But these sources aren't objectively authoritative. They're just powerful forces that successfully installed programming during your development. Recognizing conscience as installed doesn't immediately silence it. Programming runs deep, but it undermines its authority. When conscience says, "You should feel guilty," you can recognize this as programmed response, not moral truth. The guilt might still arise, but you understand its actual origin. The diversity of conscience across individuals and cultures proves it's not accessing objective morality. If it were, consciousnesses would converge. Instead, they wildly diverge. What horrifies one person's conscience is demanded by another's. Both can't be right, but both can be programmed. Updating conscience is difficult but possible. You can recognize that some installed values don't reflect your authentic preferences. You can deliberately cultivate different responses. You can reprogram, though the original programming never fully disappears. The childhood installation runs deepest. The function of conscience is self-policing. Instead of requiring external punishment for rule-breaking, conscience creates internal punishment. Guilt, a population with effective conscience, is cheaper to control. They enforce rules on themselves, saving authorities the cost of external enforcement. The fantasy of cosmic justice. Why the universe doesn't keep score. Deep in human psychology is the conviction that morality matters cosmically, that good is rewarded, evil punished, justice prevails. This just world hypothesis is comforting but completely false. The universe doesn't keep moral score. Justice is human concept that references nothing in physical reality. People who suffer often search for moral explanation. What did I do to deserve this? Assumes a cosmic system of desert. But suffering isn't distributed according to moral worth. The good suffer. The evil prosper. Children die of disease they didn't earn. Criminals live long, pleasant lives. There's no correlation between moral status and life outcomes. The just world hypothesis persists because acknowledging cosmic injustice is psychologically threatening. If bad things happen to good people randomly, then bad things could happen to you randomly. The delusion that morality protects is comforting, even though it's false. Religious systems promise cosmic justice. If not in this life, then in afterlife or reincarnation. This makes the injustice of this world tolerable by promising justice elsewhere. But there's no evidence for these justice mechanisms. They're wishful thinking, not description of reality. Karma, the idea that your actions determine your fate, is a particularly seductive form of just world thinking. But karma is unfalsifiable. Bad things happening to you must be karmic consequences of past actions, perhaps in past lives. Good things happening to bad people must be karmic rewards not yet exhausted. Any outcome can be explained, which means the theory explains nothing. The prosperity gospel that God rewards the faithful with wealth is just world thinking made explicit. Poor people must lack faith. Rich people must be blessed. This blames the victims while praising the successful, all while pretending to describe cosmic moral mechanics. Secular just world thinking is subtler, but equally baseless. What goes around comes around. Cheaters never prosper. The truth always comes out. These are comforting beliefs, not descriptions of reality. Plenty goes around that never comes around. Cheaters often prosper. Truth often stays hidden. The universe operates according to physical laws, not moral ones. Gravity doesn't care about your moral character. Disease doesn't check your virtue before infecting accidents happen randomly. The cosmos is utterly indifferent to human morality because morality is human invention, not cosmic principle. Historical evidence overwhelmingly contradicts cosmic justice. Genocides succeed. Tyrants die peacefully. Innocents suffer terribly. Guilty evade consequences. If cosmic justice existed, none of this would be possible. The fact that it's commonplace proves cosmic justice doesn't exist. The psychological function of just world belief is maintaining sense of control. If morality determines outcomes, then you can control outcomes through moral behavior. This is more comfortable than accepting that you're vulnerable to random events regardless of moral status. But just world belief creates victim blaming. If bad things happen to bad people, then people bad things happen to must be bad. Poverty becomes moral failing, disease becomes karmic consequence. Suffering becomes deserved. The just world hypothesis turns compassion into judgment. Recognizing cosmic injustice is liberating. You're not responsible for random misfortune. You don't deserve random suffering. Good behavior doesn't purchase cosmic protection. You're just vulnerable like everyone else, and moral status has nothing to do with it. This doesn't mean abandon all behavior standards. It means recognize that standards are pragmatic, not cosmic. You cooperate because cooperation produces better outcomes, not because the universe rewards cooperation. You avoid harm because you prefer not to harm, not because karma will punish you. The universe doesn't punish evil or reward good because the universe doesn't recognize these categories. Good and evil are human labels that mean nothing to physics. You're on your own in a cosmos that doesn't care about your morality. This is terrifying or liberating, depending on whether you can abandon cosmic justice fantasy. The prison of moral emotion, guilt, shame, and righteous anger as social control. Moral emotions, guilt, shame, pride, righteous anger feel like natural responses to moral reality, but they're actually trained responses to social rules. These emotions are how morality gets inside you, creating internal enforcement of external standards. Understanding their actual function is the first step toward freedom. Guilt is the emotion of rule violation. You broke a rule you accepted as valid, and guilt is the internal punishment. But the validity of the rule is assumed, not proven. You feel guilty about eating meat, not recycling, missing deadlines, all responses to rules that have no objective basis. Guilt is conscience delivering punishment for programmed rule breaking. Shame is deeper than guilt. It's not, I did bad, but I am bad. Shame is the emotion of revealed unworthiness, of exposure of fundamental inadequacy, but unworthiness relative to what? Arbitrary standards. You're ashamed of your body, your class background, your lack of achievement, all judgments against invented standards. Pride is moral self-congratulation. You followed rules, met standards, achieved goodness. But pride is based on delusion that moral achievement is real. You're proud of volunteer work as if it's objectively good. Rather than action, you happen to prefer that your culture happens to valorize. Righteous anger is the emotion of witnessed rule violation. Someone else broke rules you accept. and anger is your punishment response. But your righteous anger assumes your moral framework is correct. The person you're angry at often has different framework where their action was justified. Your anger is tribal emotion, not moral insight. These emotions are powerful social control mechanisms. Guilt prevents rule breaking through internal punishment. Shame prevents unworthiness revelation through social anxiety. Pride rewards rule following through good feelings. Righteous anger punishes others' rule breaking through social sanctioning. Together, they create comprehensive moral enforcement system. The training begins early. Children are taught to feel guilty, ashamed, proud based on adult reactions. You should be ashamed. I'm so proud of you. Don't you feel guilty? The emotions are cultivated through conditioning, becoming automatic responses later in life. Different cultures cultivate different moral emotions. Shame cultures emphasize public dishonor. Guilt cultures emphasize internal wrongness. Some cultures cultivate righteous anger. Others cultivate acceptance. The emotional landscape varies because the underlying programming varies. Moral emotions intensity doesn't indicate objective basis. You can feel crushing guilt about violating arbitrary rules. You can feel overwhelming shame about constructed inadequacies. You can feel powerful, righteous anger about imagined injustices. Intensity of feeling proves nothing about validity of underlying moral claim. The function is making you police yourself. With properly installed moral emotions, you don't need external enforcement. Guilt prevents you from breaking rules. Shame prevents you from violating norms. Pride rewards compliance. Righteous anger makes you enforce rules on others. You've become unpaid enforcer of morality you didn't choose. Recognizing moral emotions as trained responses undermines their authority. Guilt arises, but you can see it as programmed response rather than indicator of actual wrongdoing. Shame appears, but you can recognize it as internalized arbitrary standards rather than revelation of unworthiness. This doesn't make emotions immediately disappear. Conditioning is durable, but it changes your relationship to them. Instead of, I feel guilty, therefore I did wrong, it becomes, I feel guilty because I violated programmed rules that may be baseless. The emotion is data about your conditioning, not truth about morality. Moral emotions can be gradually retrained. You can cultivate different emotional responses through deliberate practice. You can reduce guilt by repeatedly acting against conditioning while recognizing nothing truly wrong occurred. You can reduce shame by rejecting standards that created it. The programming can be modified. But even without complete retraining, simple recognition is powerful. You're no longer controlled by emotions you don't understand. You see guilt, shame, pride, and righteous anger as social control mechanisms they are. This knowledge itself provides distance from their authority. The courage of amorality, living without moral guardrails. The terrifying possibility, without belief in objective morality, you might do terrible things. This fear keeps many people committed to moral fictions. Better to believe comforting lies than risk horrible truths, but this fear reveals profound mistrust of human nature, including your own. What if you don't need moral mythology to avoid becoming monster? The fear is that morality is all that prevents chaos. Remove the guardrails and you'll drive off the cliff. Without God watching, everything is permitted. Without cosmic justice, why not murder, rape, steal? This assumes the only thing preventing these acts is belief in their objective wrongness. But empirical evidence contradicts this. People who lose religious faith don't immediately become monsters. Societies that secularize don't collapse into chaos. Psychopaths who lack moral emotions are rare, and their behavior seems more genetic than philosophical. The correlation between moral belief and moral behavior is weaker than moral mythology claims. Most people don't want to harm others, regardless of moral beliefs. This preference has evolutionary and social origins. Humans are social species with empathy, cooperation, and reciprocity built in. These tendencies don't require moral justification to operate. You probably don't want to murder anyone, and this preference is enough. The question isn't, without morality, why not kill? But do you want to kill? Most people's honest answer is no, not for moral reasons, but because they simply don't want to. The preference is sufficient. Morality adds nothing except false justification for preference. Some actions you avoid because of consequences, not morality. You don't steal partly because you don't want to be punished, lose social standing, or create enemy. These pragmatic calculations remain valid whether or not theft is objectively immoral. Consequences are real. Morality is fiction. Some acts you avoid because of empathy. You don't want to cause suffering because you empathize with potential victims. This emotional response doesn't require moral overlay. Empathy is enough. The suffering you'd cause feels real and motivates avoidance regardless of moral status. The acts you're tempted to do but restrain through moral belief are worth examining. If only moral belief prevents you from harming others, you might be more dangerous than you realize. The person who refrains from murder only because they think it's objectively wrong is more concerning than the person who just doesn't want to kill. Recognizing morality as fiction might actually improve behavior. Without moral justification for violence, righteous punishment, justified war, deserved suffering, you lose rationales for harming others. Most atrocities are committed by people certain of their moral righteousness. Amorality removes this dangerous certainty. The courage of amorality is trusting your preferences and empathy over moral rules. You prefer cooperation, kindness, fairness, not because these are objectively good, but because you genuinely prefer them. This preference is more reliable foundation than belief in fictional obligations. Living immorally means acting according to actual values without pretending they're cosmic truths. You value not causing suffering? Act accordingly. You value honesty? Practice it. You value cooperation? Engage in it. But you're doing this from authentic preference, not from delusion that you're following objective morality. The challenge is others' expectations. Society expects moral justifications for actions. Why did you help? Because it's the right thing to do is accepted. Because I wanted to is met with suspicion. But honest amorality is more authentic than moral performance. The liberation is from moral anxiety. You're not constantly evaluating whether your actions are morally correct. You're not worried about moral status. You're not performing righteousness. You're simply acting according to preferences, accepting consequences, living without need for cosmic moral justification. This isn't license for cruelty. It's permission for authenticity. You don't need to pretend your preferences are obligations. You don't need to moralize your actions. You don't need to judge others morally. You can simply be preferring what you prefer, acting accordingly, without the burden of moral mythology. The equality of actions. Why murder and charity are cosmically equivalent. This is moral nihilism's hardest teaching. In cosmic terms, murder and charity are equivalent. Both are just arrangements of atoms. Both occur within physical laws. Neither has inherent moral property. The universe treats them identically. This seems obviously wrong, but that wrongness is emotional response, not logical argument. From physics perspective, murder is just matter rearrangement. One human body, atoms, applies force to another human body, atoms. Causing that body to stop functioning, atoms rearrange. There's no moral property anywhere in this description. It's just physical processes. Charity is equally physical. One human transfers resources to another human. Atoms move from one location to another. Chemical reactions in brains create satisfaction feelings. All physical, all morally neutral at cosmic level. The objection is immediate. Murder causes suffering. Charity reduces it. Suffering matters morally, but matters is human judgment. Suffering is neurological state. Calling it bad is interpretation, you add. The universe doesn't label suffering as bad, you do. The consequences differ, obviously. Murder ends consciousness. Charity improves it. One is generally undesirable, the other desirable. But undesirable and desirable are preferences, not moral facts. You prefer less suffering to more suffering. This preference is real and valid, but preference isn't morality. Different frameworks evaluate actions differently. Consequentialist framework judges by outcomes. Deontological framework judges by rule-following. Virtue framework judges by character expression. Each produces different hierarchies of action value. They can't all be objectively correct, but they can all be subjectively preferred. The cosmic equivalence of actions doesn't mean you treat them equivalently. You vastly prefer charity to murder. You structure society to prevent murder and encourage charity. These preferences and pragmatic choices are sensible, but they're based on human values, not cosmic moral facts. Even extreme cases don't break the argument. Torturing children for fun? Obviously, viscerally, seemingly, objectively wrong. But the wrongness is your strong preference against causing suffering to vulnerable beings. Evolution designed you to feel this way. Culture reinforced it. The strength of feeling doesn't make it objective moral fact. The resistance to accepting cosmic equivalence reveals how deeply moral realism penetrates. We desperately want some acts to be really, truly, objectively wrong, but wanting doesn't make it so. The universe remains indifferent to our moral categories. This teaching's value is combating moral absolutism. When you're certain your moral views are objectively true, you're dangerous. You'll impose those views on others, punish those who disagree, commit atrocities in service of righteousness. Recognizing cosmic equivalence creates humility. It also reveals morality's actual function, coordinating human preferences. We collectively prefer less suffering to more. We create rules and systems to achieve this. We call this morality, but it's really just preference coordination. Honest about what it is, it works the same but without false metaphysics. The practical implications are subtle. You still prevent and punish murder. You still encourage and reward charity. But you do this from recognition that murder produces outcomes most people want to avoid and charity produces outcomes most people prefer. Pragmatic, not moral. Accepting cosmic equivalence is emotionally difficult, but intellectually honest. Yes, murder and charity produce wildly different consequences that most people have strong preferences about. But no, neither has inherent moral property. Both are just events in a universe that doesn't assign moral value to events. The freedom beyond good and evil, what Nietzsche really meant. Nietzsche's beyond good and evil is often misunderstood as license for immorality. But he meant something more radical, the categorical transcendence of moral framework entirely, not choosing evil over good, but recognizing both as human fictions and living beyond the dichotomy. Traditional morality, for Nietzsche, was slave morality, values created by the powerless to condemn the powerful. The weak couldn't compete physically, so they invented moral superiority. They called strength evil and weakness good. This inverted natural hierarchy, making virtues of necessities. Master morality was different. Values of the strong who needed no justification. Their power was its own justification. They didn't call themselves good and enemies evil. They called themselves noble and others base. The distinction wasn't moral, but rank-based. Beyond good and evil means beyond both systems, not adopting master morality instead of slave morality, but transcending moral categories entirely. The Übermensch creates values without claiming they're objectively true, acts from preference and power without need for moral justification. This isn't sociopathic. Nietzsche wasn't advocating cruelty. He was advocating authentic value creation over borrowed morality. Don't accept values from religion, culture, or philosophy. Create your own values, knowing they're your creation, living them fully without pretending they're cosmic truths. The will to power is drive to expand, create, overcome, not domination over others necessarily, but self-overcoming. Becoming more than you were, creating what you value. Living without resentment toward those who embody values different from yours. Nietzsche saw morality as nihilism in disguise. By positing another world, heaven forms afterlife, where true value exists, this worldly value is denied, life becomes mere preparation for real life elsewhere. This is ultimate nihilism, denying the only life you have in favor of imagined alternative. Beyond good and evil means affirming this world, this life, without need for transcendent justification. Say yes to existence as it is, suffering included. Don't need morality to make suffering meaningful. Suffering simply is, and you endure it or overcome it without moral narrative. The eternal return thought experiment. Would you live your life exactly the same way infinitely? If answer is no, you're living wrong, according to others' values, not your own. The person beyond good and evil would say yes because they're living authentically, creating values rather than following them. Critics see Nietzsche as dangerous. If no objective morality, then anything goes. But Nietzsche's point was that anything already goes. Morality was never stopping anything. It was just interpretation system. Beyond good and evil isn't license for chaos, but recognition that chaos was always permitted. We just created rules and pretended they were cosmic. The courage this requires is substantial. You must create values knowing they're arbitrary. You must act powerfully, knowing you're not objectively justified. You must live fully, knowing life has no inherent meaning. Most people prefer comforting moral fictions to challenging amorality, but the freedom is worth it. You're no longer bound by inherited morality. You're not judging yourself by others' standards. You're not performing goodness for imaginary audience. You're creating values that serve your life affirmation rather than following values that deny life. Beyond good and evil isn't easy or safe. It's intellectually demanding and emotionally challenging. But it's honest in ways morality never is. It acknowledges that values are human creation, while morality pretends they're cosmic discovery. Honest creation beats dishonest discovery. The problem with compassion. When empathy becomes its own trap. Compassion is usually considered unquestionably good, the moral emotion par excellence. But even compassion, examined nihilistically, reveals problems. It's not objectively good, and its uncritical practice can cause harm. Understanding compassion's limits is part of valuelessness liberation. Compassion evolved to serve group cohesion. Feeling others' suffering motivated help, which built cooperation. But evolution optimized for genetic success, not for accessing moral truth. Compassion is survival mechanism, not moral insight. That you feel compassion doesn't prove compassion is objectively good. Compassion is selective. You feel more for family than strangers, for attractive people than unattractive, for people like you than different from you. This isn't moral failing, it's how empathy evolved. But it reveals compassion isn't universal moral principle, but biased emotional response. Compassion fatigue demonstrates its limits. You cannot sustain empathy for all suffering. The nurse who cares for every patient fully burns out. The activist who empathizes with every injustice collapses. Compassion requires boundaries, which contradicts its supposed universal application. Compassion can motivate harm. Parents' compassion for child leads to overprotection that stunts growth. Communities' compassion for addicts enables addiction. Society's compassion for criminals produces ineffective justice. Compassion without wisdom produces suffering it aims to prevent. Sentimentality, excessive, indulgent compassion, is particularly problematic. It feels good to feel compassionate, so people cultivate compassion as emotional indulgence. This is compassion performed for self, not practiced for others. The performance might not help anyone, but makes performer feel virtuous. Compassion can be weaponized. How can you be so uncompassionate? Is moral shaming disguised as empathy appeal? Compassion becomes social pressure. You must care about this issue, help this group, feel this suffering, or you're morally deficient. Compassion polices rather than liberates. The imperative to be compassionate creates its own suffering. You should care about everything terrible happening everywhere. But comprehensive compassion is impossible. The gap between infinite suffering and finite empathy creates guilt, anxiety, inadequacy. Compassion obligation becomes compassion burden. Distinguishing genuine compassion from performed compassion is difficult. Are you helping because you genuinely empathize, or because helping makes you feel good about yourself? Both can produce same actions, but motivations differ. Honest self-examination often reveals self-interest hiding behind compassion. Compassion without action is emotionally indulgent. Feeling bad about suffering without working to prevent it produces emotional experience without practical benefit. The person who cares deeply but does nothing is performing compassion for themselves, not practicing it for others. Recognizing compassion as evolved emotion rather than moral truth doesn't eliminate it. You still feel empathy. You still prefer to reduce suffering, but you're honest about what compassion is. Biological tendency you happen to have, not cosmic moral principle you must follow. This enables more effective compassion. Without moral obligation to empathize with everyone, you can choose where to direct limited empathy. Without guilt about insufficient compassion, you can act pragmatically. Without performing compassion, you can help more effectively. The liberation is from compassion obligation. You don't have to care about everything. You don't have to feel everyone's suffering. You don't have to empathize universally. You can choose where to direct compassion based on your preferences and capacity, without moral guilt about compassion's limits. The end of judgment. What happens when you stop evaluating morally? Moral judgment is constant mental activity. This person is good. That action is wrong. This behavior is admirable. That choice is condemnable. The evaluation never stops, creating exhausting moral commentary on everything. What if you just stopped judging morally? Judgment requires belief in moral reality. If you know what's objectively right, you can judge who's following it. But without moral reality, judgment loses foundation. You still observe actions and consequences, but you stop categorizing them as morally good or evil. The immediate effect is mental quiet. The judgmental voice that constantly evaluates everyone morally falls silent. You see behavior without moral overlay. Person does X. That's just observation, not judgment. The moral interpretation that follows observation becomes optional. Understanding replaces judgment. Instead of, they're bad for doing that, you examine why they did it. Their history, pressures, perspectives, calculations. This doesn't excuse harmful actions but provides context. Understanding is more useful than judgment and less emotionally draining. Relationships transform without judgment. You're not mentally categorizing people as good or bad. You're not maintaining moral scorecards. You're not withdrawing love when someone fails moral standards. You interact with people as they are, not as moral performers. Judgment of self also dissolves. You stop evaluating yourself as morally good or bad. You examine whether your actions produce preferred consequences, but you're not assigning moral grades. The self-judgment that creates so much suffering has no foundation without moral reality. This doesn't mean you become passive about harmful behavior. You still oppose harm, still protect victims, still punish wrongdoers. But you do this pragmatically because you prefer less harm, not judgmentally because wrongdoers are evil. The person who harms others is product of causes, acting from their perspective, producing outcomes you want to prevent. This is understanding, not moral judgment. You prevent their harmful acts without needing to condemn them morally. The practical response is identical. The judgmental overlay is removed. Non-judgment reveals how much suffering judgment creates. The constant moral evaluation of self and others is exhausting. The emotional energy spent on righteous indignation is wasted. The social division created by moral judgment is destructive. Removing judgment removes these problems. Cultural judgment also dissolves. Different cultures have different practices. Without moral framework, you don't judge one superior to another. You observe differences, understand contexts, have preferences, but you're not ranking cultures morally. This reduces ethnocentrism and cultural arrogance. Political judgment similarly transforms. Instead of good versus evil political sides, you see different values and interests competing for power. You still have preferences, still participate, but you're not morally judging opponents as evil. You're recognizing value differences and interest conflicts. The challenge is others expect judgment. Isn't that terrible? Requires agreeing it's terrible. Moral judgment. Refusing judgment is interpreted as approval, but you're not approving. You're just not judging. This distinction is difficult for morally minded people to grasp. Non-judgment might seem cold, but it's actually warmer than judgment. Judgment creates distance. You're good, they're bad. Understanding creates connection. We're all products of causes, doing our best given our circumstances. Non-judgment is more humanizing than moral evaluation. The acceptance, living comfortably in a valueless universe. We arrive at acceptance, not defeat, but recognition. Values don't exist objectively. Good and evil are fictions. Morality is human invention. This is reality, not tragedy. Living in valueless universe isn't burden, but liberation from burden of moral mythology. Acceptance doesn't mean value nihilism in practical sense. You still have preferences, goals, values, but you recognize them as yours, not cosmic truths. You prefer kindness, but kindness isn't objectively good. You disvalue cruelty, but cruelty isn't objectively evil. Preferences are enough. The universe's valuelessness means you're free to create values, not discover them, not access them, not follow them. Create them. Your values are your creations, and this authorship is liberating. You're responsible to yourself, not to imaginary cosmic moral order. Living in valueless universe means actions have consequences but not moral properties. You act, consequences follow. you respond. This pragmatic cycle doesn't require moral overlay. Consequences are real. Morality's interpretation of consequences is optional addition that serves no practical purpose. Others' moral claims lose power when you recognize valuelessness. Someone says you should do X. You ask why. They appeal to goodness, rightness, duty. You recognize these as baseless. You might do X for pragmatic reasons, but moral obligation has no force. Social coordination continues without morality. We negotiate preferences, establish rules, enforce consequences. But honestly, this is preference coordination, not moral truth implementation. The honesty improves coordination by removing false certainty and moral absolutism. Acceptance eliminates moral anxiety. You're not constantly worried about moral status, not guilty about moral failures, not proud of moral achievements, not judging self or others morally. The entire dimension of moral evaluation is recognized as responding to fictions. This isn't descent into chaos. It's recognition that chaos was always the baseline and order was always human creation. Morality didn't prevent chaos. Consequences and preferences did. Removing moral mythology leaves practical reality unchanged. The valueless universe is actually beautiful. No cosmic judgment hangs over you. No moral scorekeeper tracks your actions. No ultimate meaning requires achievement. You exist temporarily in indifferent cosmos, free to create meaning, values, purposes that serve your life. Children are born into valueless universe before moral conditioning. They act from preferences, respond to consequences, live without guilt or righteousness. Then we teach them morality, installing anxiety and judgment. But the underlying valuelessness remains. We just cover it with moral mythology. Acceptance is return to valuelessness with adult understanding. You see through moral fictions while navigating social systems that use moral language. You act from preferences while others act from imagined obligations. You live honestly in reality while most live confused in moral mythology. The comfort of acceptance grows over time. Initially, valuelessness might seem destabilizing, but gradually you realize it's liberating. You don't need cosmic permission to live. You don't need moral justification for preferences. You don't need universal values to create personal ones. Acceptance means saying yes to valueless universe, yes to cosmic indifference, yes to moral fictions as fictions, yes to preference-based living, yes to creating meaning rather than discovering it. This yes is freedom from moral burden. The liberation. Why valuelessness is the ultimate freedom. We end where nihilism truly begins, with liberation. The recognition that good and evil are human inventions, that moral obligations don't exist, that valuelessness is reality. This isn't depressing conclusion, but liberating, beginning freedom from moral mythology is the deepest freedom possible. You're free from cosmic judgment. No God watches your actions morally. No universe tracks your sins. No karma awaits your mistakes. You act, consequences follow, life continues. The imagined moral consequences, divine punishment, cosmic justice, karmic return, are revealed as fictions. What remains is just actual consequences, which you navigate pragmatically. You're free from ought tyranny. All the shoulds and musts and oughts that commanded your life lose their authority. You should be kind, says who? You must be productive. According to what? You ought to feel guilty? Based on what? Without objective morality, imperatives are revealed as just someone's preferences claiming false authority. You're free from moral performance. You don't need to demonstrate righteousness. Don't need to signal virtue. Don't need to prove you're good. The exhausting performance of moral adequacy is unnecessary once you recognize moral categories as fictions. You can simply be without performing goodness for imaginary moral audience. You're free from moral judgment of others. You don't need to categorize people as good or evil, don't need to condemn the immoral or praise the virtuous, don't need to maintain mental hierarchy of moral worth. You can understand everyone as products of causes, acting from their perspectives, equally lacking objective moral status. You're free from guilt's unique suffering. Regret about consequences is natural, but guilt about moral failure requires believing in moral reality. Without that belief, guilt loses foundation. You might regret actions' outcomes, but you're not tormented by having violated cosmic moral law because no such law exists. You're free from meaning obligation. You don't need to find life's inherent meaning because there isn't one. You don't need to fulfill cosmic purpose because purpose is human invention. You can create meanings that serve your life without pretending you discovered meanings that were always there. You're free from moral anxiety, the constant worry about moral adequacy. Am I good enough? Am I doing right? Am I morally acceptable? This anxiety requires believing moral adequacy is real, and you might lack it. Recognize morality as fiction, and the anxiety dissolves. You're adequate because adequacy is preference-based, not moral-based. You're free from others' moral control. When someone tries to control you through moral claims, you should, you must, good people do. You recognize these as power moves disguised as moral truths. You're not obligated to accept their moral framework. You evaluate their demands pragmatically, not morally. You're free to create values that serve you. Instead of discovering or accessing objective values, you create values that enable your flourishing. These values are tools, not truths. When values stop serving you, you change them. You're author of your values rather than supplicant to objective morality. You're free from moral perfectionism's impossible demands. You don't need to be morally perfect because moral perfection is incoherent concept. You can act according to preferences, accept imperfection, change when change serves you, all without moral self-flagellation. You're free from righteousness's exhausting burden. You don't need to be right in cosmic moral sense. Don't need to prove your moral superiority. Don't need to vanquish moral opponents. You have preferences and perspectives. Others have different ones. And nobody's accessing objective moral truth. This freedom doesn't make you worse. It might make you better. Free from moral performance, you can help authentically. Free from moral judgment, you can understand compassionately. Free from moral anxiety, you can act effectively. The liberation from moral mythology serves practical ethical living better than morality itself. The ultimate freedom is living without the burden of moral reality that never existed. You're free because the chains were always imaginary. You're liberated because the prison was constructed from fictions. You're released because you recognize there was never anything truly binding you. This is the liberation of valuelessness, the recognition that in a universe without objective good or evil, you're free to live according to authentic preferences rather than imagined obligations, free to act from understanding rather than judgment, free to create values rather than discover them, free to simply be without cosmic moral justification. The burden is lifted, the mythology is dissolved, the freedom is complete. You're living in valueless universe, and that valuelessness is not deprivation, but liberation, the deepest freedom possible, the freedom from moral fictions that never deserved the authority you granted them. This is liberation. This is freedom. This is the truth that good and evil are human inventions, and recognizing this truth sets you free.